Evans. So one of the things I have to tell you is that there's a recording in progress. And if you could put any questions that you have during the talk into the chat box, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. So so what can I say? So I met Dan, I think it was last March actually, at an Agritech East event for Elms, and we were in a workshop together. And it was at that point I realised not only was Dan an extremely knowledgeable chap and knew an awful lot about science, soil science and sustainable agriculture, he was an extremely passionate chap as well, and a pleasure to meet. So today he's going to talk to us about a project called Urban Cultivate, which is integrating environmental, spatial and social data to assign food supply chain functions across urban space. And so I'll hand over to you now, Dan.
That's great. Thank you so much, Laurie. And it's really good. Can you hear me? Those kind of technical things sorted out before we start. So hopefully the Wi-Fi holds up. If it doesn't, then do let me know. I'm just going to share my screen. See if that shares. There you go. Can someone hear that, or can someone see that? Yeah, I think
we can see that. That's fine.
Heads nodding. That's great. Super. So thank you so much again, Laurie, for inviting me here to this SDFC webinar. And yes, I remember that Elms event very well. And actually, it's I didn't go to that event necessarily with the urban soil hat on, but in many ways, actually, there isn't much to distinguish between some of the things we were talking about there in terms of sustainable land management in the rural sector. Those kinds of themes crop up in urban thinking and urban studies as well. So, and I think you'll get a sense of that as we go through the presentation today. So I've been asked to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes or so, and then what I'm hoping is that we have questions and discussion, and maybe more of an open discussion towards the end of the webinar. And I think at any point, if you want to leave a question in the chat, that's possible, but we'll take those at the end, I think. So yeah, so this is a 1-year proof of concept project, and it's funded by the Science and Technology Facilities Council. It's an STFC Food Network supported project. And as it says on the slide there, it's a proof of concept. It's a 1-year project. So what I'm going to do today is present, in a sense, where we are, because we're about 3 months away from completion of that project. But as many of you, I'm sure, know, about 65% maybe of the work takes place in the last couple of months. But I mean, we'll go through that project. But just to begin with, I just wanted to introduce myself, because outside of this project, I have a fellowship program which is probably a little bit broader than the remit. But just to let you know that I am based at the Cranfield University School of Water, Energy and Environment, and I hold a research fellowship called Building Tomorrow's Soils, which in a sense is focused on how we might form soils and the kind of materials, the resources that we use to form soils. And this could take place not only in the kind of the rural natural settings. So most of my previous work has been around soil formation from bedrock, but to urban settings, and increasingly now to towns and cities, how we might form new soils for urban green infrastructure. And in a sense, just a few kind of projects in the last year or so that I'm working on or have worked on. Most of these are Research Council funded projects, but they're around manufacturing soil or cultivating food from soil, or thinking about the ecosystem services, the wider ecosystem services that may come from food growing in urban spaces. And in one particular one which kind of launched, I guess, some of my interests in urban food growing was when I was a postdoc on the Urban Revolution project, and that was a global food security program project, which I'm sure many of you here today have at least heard about, perhaps been part of. So in a sense, the background, I guess, to the project, which I'm going to talk about today, Urban Cultivate, comes from acknowledging perhaps 4 key areas of issues, and those are kind of highlighted in the black boxes on the left of the slide there. What we have currently, I think, is a situation where we concentrate urban food growing on a few kind of established growing sites, allotments, growing spaces, community gardens, and so on. And as a result, the soils become quite overworked, and as a result, this causes declines in their ability to function in their what we call natural capital. But kind of aside from the soils, and perhaps aside from some of the more natural ecosystem services, if we place all of the food growing activities on these relatively few sites in urban spaces, it kind of limits the distribution and the accessibility of these green spaces for to the members of the public. So we have not only an environmental challenge, but also a social one. And if we only use these spaces for urban agriculture, in other words, cultivating food, fruit and vegetables, then other key nodes of that wider food supply chain cannot take place very easily. And what I'm talking about there are things like basic functions like composting, food waste collection, perhaps germinating seedlings, and even food exchange, knowledge exchange. You know, the reason why we might grow food in towns and cities is to develop not only new networks, new communities, but to exchange knowledge and skills and technical know-how with the local community. And finally, if the urban agriculture spaces are disconnected, then we have inefficiencies within the food supply chain. And so I think what we were as a project team thinking about when bidding for this STFC Food Network project is to develop a new local self-sufficient and a strategy which is based on circular economy, which is really geared to secure for the local community not only a nutritious and sustainable food supply chain, but a resilient one as well, and ensure at the same time that we achieve those social value outcomes like equality, diversity, health and well-being, and so on. And that might seem quite a challenge for a one-year project, but that whole ethos of creating a new system is one which we realized would require some multidisciplinary methods, certainly a multidisciplinary team, and also the integration of different types of data sets. So if at the moment you're wondering, well, hang on, why is this an STFC funded project? Why is this not a NERC funded project? Well, it's because we are, and as you will see, integrating multiple types of data into eventually into a model which will be able to tell us which spaces around cities and towns across the UK are able to develop different fruit and vegetable supply chains. So yes, in a sense, our aim is to integrate 3 sets of data, so environmental, spatial and social data, and we're going to collect those data from a cluster of underutilized vacant city spaces, and using and integrating those data to determine how best to use these spaces so that we develop and support that local circular and sustainable food supply chain. So there's quite a lot there to kind of unpack. Well, not only are we thinking about different types of data, but we're also thinking about underutilized vacant city spaces. And the objectives of the project, at least in this proof of concept phase, are not to start implementing solutions in space, in giving the community, in a sense, a new greenhouse, or giving the community a new food exchange space, but rather to build up a model and eventually a dashboard so that urban land planners and local communities can work together to find what the most optimum use of these vacant spaces are. So the objectives really are to map networks or clusters of underutilized sites at the ward scale, and I'll explain a little bit about the local context in a moment around where we are working. And then to collect the environment, spatial and social data from those sites and use those, integrate those to build a model so that we're able to optimize and assign different food supply chain functions. So we know that some sites, if you picture your local town or city, for example, some sites will be best for urban food exchange or perhaps food waste collection because they're more accessible, whilst other sites may be better for germinating seedlings or cultivating at a larger scale because of their unique spatial, environmental and social characteristics. So in this sense, our USP here is to think that each site has, in a sense, its own virtues, and those virtues can work together to create a local food supply chain. But why would we even think about using vacant spaces? Well, you know, we have quite a lot of knowledge, I would say, or reasonably, kind of relatively speaking, about the conventional growing spaces, so allotments, community gardens and so on. But actually, the potential of these underutilized areas are little pockets of vacant spaces in towns and cities. That's where we have less knowledge and less understanding. And these can range all the way from rooftops, multi-story car parks, construction sites, and so on. On the right here, you can see the space in between two buildings being used for some urban green infrastructure. And one might be able to imagine something on top of these buildings as well. So by diversifying where we grow, by using some of these unspoken for spaces, we can reduce the burden on the existing sites. So we can perhaps give some of those soils a rest for a year or so to replenish their nutrients and organic matter. We also, at the same time, green more of the urban environment. So it's a win-win, I think, for most. And finally, we spread the risk of disruption or disturbance to the system. And of course, over COVID, we got to see this in action, where our global food supply chain was threatened, and we started using our own window boxes, our own gardens, perhaps signing up to have a patch and an allotment to create our own fruit and vegetables. So in a sense, we were able to maximize that ability to build resilience in urban systems. So I mentioned that we were working in a ward, at the ward scale, and let me kind of take you there in a sense virtually. So we're working currently in the London Borough of Islington, and in a sense we're using this borough as, in many ways, a kind of case study to develop this model and dashboard. And by no means do we want to end at the ward level, at the borough scale. We certainly want to upscale in the future, but there's many reasons why we might go to somewhere like Islington for this, and let me explain that for a few moments. So some of you may know the history of urban agriculture. Certainly in London, kind of during and after World War II, significant portions of land were allocated to support horticulture. And of course, that gets back to that point I was making a moment ago around building resilience to disturbance. And what this did was provide quite significant quantities of fruit and vegetables to London markets, kind of a local supply chain in a sense. And you kind of go forward perhaps 60, 70 years, and we see quite an urgent need for new housing. There's a booming housing market, a lot of spare land around many boroughs, certainly in Islington, has been prioritised for development. So that may be residential kind of housing or commercial development. That said, though, there is an interest in self-sufficiency and in building new urban green spaces at the city scale. Certainly across London, there is great momentum now from the Mayor's office to do that. But at the local scale in Islington, in the last year or so, perhaps in the last 5 years, but certainly in the last couple of years, we're seeing, you know, arguably kind of an exponential rise of interest in creating green spaces, and particularly harnessing the local community's enthusiasm to grow their own fruit and vegetables. So here on the slide, you can see kind of clippings of very recent projects that have taken place, or organisations that have been part of this effort. And I don't know if you know, but Islington is actually the capital's most crowded borough. So for those of you who are still tuned into the football and can picture, it's 104 people approximately living on a football pitch-sized area of land. It's a very dense borough. And almost a third of the households in the London Borough of Islington have no private outdoor space. So which this kind of means that their access to areas to grow their fruit and vegetables is very limited. But there is a significant amount of what we might call vacant or underutilized space. And I'll show you that in a moment. But just to kind of flag one particular initiative, and for the last, well, just over a decade now, there's a network which we are working part of, or I should say, we are collaborating with them on this project, and that's the Octopus Community Network. The Octopus Community Network has been developing and really leading on food growing across Islington for about 10 years. And at one of the sites off Tufnell Park Road, in the last 4 to 5 years, they've developed a community plant nursery, and you can see that I kind of zoomed into it. It's an area to the right of this sports pitch. There's a better photograph of it in a moment. And the reason I picked this out is because not only because they are a great proponent of the project Urban Cultivate, but also they have very much a local food supply chain pretty much in that plant nursery. So if you have a moment, perhaps after the busyness of Christmas and you're in London, head over to Tufnell Park Road and see for yourself a nursery which combines composting, so soil formation, through to cultivating, and large-scale cultivating, not only in boxes, but in a variety of different techniques, but also, and most importantly, I think, food exchange and knowledge exchange. And recently they celebrated a new, you can see in the bottom right, a new pavilion, which is where they do some of their learning and knowledge exchange programs. So in one site, you have a real network, a real cluster of food supply chain functions, and they were very heavily supported by the local community and Islington Council, of course. And you can read more in that Guardian article on the left there. We were very lucky actually to launch this project to the public at this Octopus Community Plant Nursery last year. So, you know, taking that perhaps as one space, the question is, well, in and around that nursery site where there's so much momentum and interest in growing fruit and vegetables, where else could we expand the nursery spaces? In other words, which sites are available and accessible for other food supply chain functions in and around that nursery area? So what we were doing at the start of this project is doing very much a very macro scale study of the area using satellite and GIS information data that we have to map and identify the areas which are not currently in use for food growing. And in many of these spaces, you can see here towards the top of the image, quite derelict land, which perhaps had a use in 10, 15 years ago, but has since become more derelict and more abandoned. So mapping these spaces out. And one of the things that we started to do was kind of cluster these sites. So this is not a kind of complicated map with lots of numbers, but if you disregard the numbers for the moment and just focus on where the color is. So I've highlighted where Octopus Plant Nursery is, and that's kind of our observatory site, if you like, our kind of our access point. And in and around that point, there are areas which have not been developed, have not been so much used. Some of these are abandoned areas, some of these are less abandoned, but are green areas which could be developed into more food growing initiatives. And we clustered these so that we could potentially think about using these clusters as a local food supply chain. So we know that these spaces are not large enough, or perhaps not sufficiently equipped to supply all of those functions, so composting, cultivation, food exchange, knowledge exchange, and so on. But if they each took one of those functions in a cluster, they could work together to create a local food supply chain for the community. So we have two clusters off Tufnell Park Road, and one which is down at the Holloway Estate, also in the St George's Ward, just off Parkhurst Road in Islington as well. So these are very concentrated sites, very densely connected sites. And just to kind of provide maybe a clearer image of what these sites may look like. So those more north clusters, cluster A and B, up off Tufnell Park Road, are shown here. The stars kind of representing some of the areas which we've identified as potential sites. And it's worth bearing in mind that throughout this process, we've always been in consultation with the local managers and the policymakers that govern these areas. So Islington Council, the London Borough of Islington Council, has been very supportive of this project and have supported us in going out and learning more about these areas. So we do want to acknowledge the council and the team there in the Greening the Public Realm department. And likewise, Holloway Estate, I quite like this example because what you can see here is a wide variety of different types of sites. So we have an existing green space, which is somewhat underused by the local community, the local residents, but certainly areas providing shading. You've got some areas which are lacking any soil at all, so potential areas though for some other food supply functions such as food exchange. You can imagine food exchange happening quite centrally here. And then behind this block of flats here, we have an existing allotment site which could be expanded out onto this unused car park. So lots of different types of spaces available to us. And by using GIS data, so this is almost like a first pass, we can find out some of the kind of core properties of some of these sites. So we can, what we've done has been mapping these spaces, calculating area, geometry, and so on. And we can get a kind of a rough first pass look at the types and diversity of the sites that we have. And, taking away some of the other buildings on the map to the left, you can see that the sites we have, they all very, very much differ in shape and size. And incidentally, on this left-hand map, you might see a couple of other clusters, which I haven't highlighted yet. We have disregarded cluster C because that's currently in the Holloway prison, so that's managed very differently, but one certainly we could look at. And cluster E we've not looked at because what we're trying to do here is build up a prototype with a few clusters and then expand, but we've already kind of begun to look for other sites and other clusters, and certainly cluster E might be one for the future. So we've got the sites, and what we've been doing the last few months is collecting data. And, you know, as I said at the beginning, one of the types of data we've been collecting are the environmental data and the microclimates, so things like temperature and precipitation, the amount of hours of sunlight and shade and so on. Certainly myself, I've been very keen to get my hands dirty, as it were, with the soil analysis, and we've got those currently being analysed pretty much as we speak. And then the air quality as well. And what we realise is that these urban environments pose a very unique environmental gradient. So although at the moment we're only concentrating on ground-based sites, we might in the future think about using rooftops or perhaps urban roofs, and at that stage we might realize that air quality up there is significantly different to that down at the base. So certainly we have made many assumptions, and there are limitations to the environmental data collection, and not least, of course, the fact that doing any of this work requires great coordination with the local residents, the people who live and work around here, and we've been very sensitive to that. So bearing that in mind, nonetheless, we have got quite a substantial data set emerging from these sites, and that's been supplemented by the work of our project partners over in our industry partner, AGGL, Agriculture Global, and what they've been doing and what they are experts at is doing spatial data collection of sites. So the kind of the multidisciplinary nature of the team is really quite useful here, because so what they've been able to do is not just think about the sites, but how they're integrated into the wider spaces. So not only measuring proximity to, you know, very important utilities like electricity and water and lighting, but thinking about how these different spaces, how these different sites are integrated in the community. And on the right hand side, it might look quite strange, but it's an actual map showing the different levels of connectivity that different roads in London have, and you can see that the kind of main arterial roads, so those ones in red there, which are kind of the key networks, the key main roads, perhaps the A roads that go through London, and then over in the green and blue, some of the lesser used, less accessible sites and roads around that. So we can use things like gate analysis to inform us about the popularity of some of these sites to the public, their accessibility, their visibility, and that might lead into questions around security of the sites, and that's certainly important if you're developing fruit and vegetables for local community. We want to obviously bear all those kind of things in mind. And a great example of this is, you know, if we want the local community to be part of this and build up something from the grassroots, we need sites which are accessible and visible, but also safe as well. So there's a lot of very different characteristics and criteria that we have to think about. And that kind of neatly links into the third and the final type of data, which is the social data. And we presented at the Environment and Regeneration Scrutiny Committee back in July. Thank you, Laurie. Apologies for that. I think I had some audio difficulties as well, but I'm just going to minimize that. So yeah, so just to refresh then, what we've done is we've collected environment data, spatial data, as I said, and maybe it was cut off, but the social data we are going to be collecting as part of a follow-up ethnographic study. So in a sense, what we need to do now in the final phase of this project is to integrate the environmental and spatial data. And as you can imagine, what we're having, the challenge that this confronts us with is by integrating different types of data, not only quantitative data, but qualitative data as well. So we've been working very well with the University of Sussex in the last 6 or so months, with Dr. Peter Hurley, our STFC champion, and also the his Biscus student Joseph Starkey. And what Joe's been able to develop for us is an optimization model, which looks a little bit like, you can see that in the right-hand part of the slide. But just to briefly take you through this, and for those who have attended this today with an interest in how STFC has come into this project, well, the first thing that we've been doing is programming a function that takes the data from the environment and takes spatial data and converts these data to a score of suitability for each of the food supply chain functions. So at this point, we're accepting that each site could do any of the food supply chain functions, from waste collection, soil formation, cultivating, food exchange, and so on. And they're all given a score of suitability for each of these functions. And then the suitability scores are determined by using kind of ideal or threshold values. So if we have, for instance, a site with soil contaminated above the fatal loading threshold, or perhaps we have air quality which is not sufficient for growing fruit and vegetables, or perhaps some of the accessibility is low, we can determine that suitability based on those ideal values. So that's the first function. The second function basically takes the suitability scores and re-weights them based on the available score in the region. So if you can picture the cluster, we might have 5 or 6 sites. One of the sites will have the best score for food exchange. Another one of those sites might have the worst score, and so these are assigned accordingly. And what we have there then is, let's say, the most optimal configuration of the sites against each of the food supply chain functions. So we might have site 1, which is best for cultivation. Site 3 might be worse for cultivation, but it might be best for food exchange. Site 2 might be not so bad for food exchange, but actually might be really good for collecting waste and forming soil. So you can see that by using this optimization model, we can optimize each site for different food supply chain functions. And that's the back end of this model. And what Joe's been doing in the last month or so is creating a user-friendly dashboard that shows the area of the map. So in this case, using some dummy data that's based on Brighton. But once we've created the map of Islington, we can highlight each of the sites that we've studied in this project and color them based on the most optimized function. And so it's a user-friendly, very accessible way of sharing that data and so that number crunching with the public, with the users and the stakeholders. And of course, for some people, they might want to turn off functions because they're not interested in food exchange, or they're not interested in collecting waste. And we've got that capability in the dashboard. So yeah, finally, and I suppose just to conclude, this is the first phase of what we hope to be a multi-phase project. So after the new year, we're going to launch our communication strategy. We've got an Urban Cultivate website, which will be launched very shortly. You can catch up on more of the news around this project. And of course, as I said before, we're developing that ethnographic study to collect social data as well. We hope for those who are in the community or very interested in this, feel free to reach out to attend. We're holding a stakeholder workshop in February, and what we're aiming to do there is build or co-develop this ethnographic study with the local community. We're also reporting to Islington Council and that Environment and Regeneration Scrutiny Committee in January as well. We're very much appreciative of the links with policymakers so early on in this proof of concept project. And then towards future, looking ahead to the next year or so, not only are we wanting to upscale this, so go from borough scale to city scale, and what that might mean to our methodologies, how we might have to adapt our methodology to do that upscaling, but also explore the potential of the dashboard, which is a real STFC win, I think, for the local community. Use that as a kind of commercial product for urban land planners around the UK and abroad to start to identify their own spaces and start to assess the suitability of those spaces for urban agriculture. So thank you very much. I'll be very happy to take any questions. I'll stop sharing there. You can find some more information on the screen about my contact details, but I'll stop sharing and very happy to take your questions. I think it's back to Laurie at this stage.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was an absolutely brilliant talk, very informative, and stunning how much you've done for a one-year project. It really is. I was going to ask everyone, we lost the questions, unfortunately, in the transition. So if you haven't already, if you could pop your question into the side box. And we have some quite specific questions, but I'll just give everyone a moment to put anything else that they want to in the side box, and cheekily ask my own question, which is something that's always bothered me, is that the construction industry aren't obligated enough to put in mind things like food systems and functionality when they're building their huge new estates. And I think your model, I guess it's one of those, or it's more of a statement than a question thing. Your model is the perfect example of where they can for example, if you're building up a high-rise set of flats, then you're able to build in the collection of that food waste, and you've got a very high score for a particular function of the supply chain, and they could consider what the area already looks like and think, what is it low in? What do we need to build in to enhance the whole region and not just the construction area that we're working in. So I guess my question is, do you see, how do you see this project being able to transfer knowledge to such different sectors like the construction?
Absolutely. Well, I think, one of the key selling points perhaps of this dashboard is the fact that not only can you use it to develop new sites, and that might be for urban agriculture or urban green infrastructure or any other function that you wish, but also to evaluate the sites that you might have developed previously retrospectively. So you can take a site, collect the data for that site and do that retrospective evaluation of, did you make the right decision? At the time, you may not have had all the data to make that decision, because maybe it was done based on pressure groups, or perhaps it was a political decision, or perhaps it was a decision based on economic reasons. We can actually evaluate some of those decisions. And I think the interesting bit now is that the dashboard currently is set up to look at functions of urban food growing, but in the future, we could look at other functions like net zero carbon, sequestering carbon into soils, developing biodiversity in the city as well.
Absolutely.
And some of that kind of water drainage. So all of those functions, it doesn't have to be food growing. It's obviously an agri-food seminar, but this dashboard has that kind of flexibility that in the future it could be used for other types of sectors.
And food growing doesn't have to just be horticultural. It can be bees, it can be pigs. I mean, I lived in Bristol where they had a wonderful urban farm right in the centre that had pigs in it, so it can be broader than that. And I think that does need to be considered, because these food systems, especially if you're linking them up to food banks, They need to be high calorie. You know, it's lovely to grow realms of lettuce, but actually, if you really want them to be used and useful, then you have to be thinking about those high calorie foods. Right, so I'm going to quickly just look at the right here. So we have a question from Beth Mead, and she said, Dan, you mentioned air quality in the study area. Will you be looking at how urban air quality affects the quality and the safety of fruits and vegetables produced at the sites?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Beth, for your question. And this is a really important aspect of our environmental data collection campaign, the air quality measurements we were doing. I have to admit that there are so many, let's say, variables that affect air quality, which we probably haven't measured in this to a sufficient standard, at least in this proof of concept project. But certainly this is an important one, because when we've talked to the community in and around these spaces, the first thing that they talk about is contamination and pollution. Some of our sites are off Tufnell Park Road or off Parkhurst Road. There are sites which are very connected to high traffic areas. So this is something which we're certainly looking at in the project. We're integrating air quality measurements into our dashboard. But what we hope in the future is that not only, problem is, if you try to upscale this to the city, you can't go out and measure air quality across the whole city. So we have to have something in situ at that point and collect data across those spaces. So it's a balance between doing something at high spatial resolution, but also something which is scalable in the future. And I think we're just at that kind of transition point now.
Sir, I'm Suman Saurabh. I'm a nutritional research scientist. I want to ask that, do you have any research regarding using of chemical herbicides, just like glyphosate, in agriculture purposes? As we see that 2,4-D, pendimethalin, and glycol, especially glyphosate-based herbicide, are affecting much more than the other things. Just in the recent past years, we have seen that the pollution from the agri sector, especially from the herbicide, has been increased very much. So that have you thought about it? That's how to find the organic solution so that we can get rid of it.
Well, it's a very important point. I think in this project, it goes beyond the scope of the remit of this STFC project, but certainly colleagues of mine in Cranfield University and myself to some extent are looking at urban soil quality and thinking about the legacy of previous activity on those soils. So there isn't an area we were looking at. It's actually an old, most of the sites are in old bomb sites from the last war. So we have the legacy of that. We also have the legacy of contamination more recently to look at as well. And some of these sites might well have been used in the past for that urban food growing campaign that I talked about during the last war. They might have used those areas to do that, but we don't know the full. We don't have a comprehensive history of the site to be able to determine how much of pesticide was used. But we are looking at soil quality in the environmental data collection. But I must admit, at this stage, with the remit of the project that it is, this isn't a soil science project, so we're not going deep into the soil science at this stage. And one of the reasons for this is that we want this to be user-friendly in the future, and for this to be a user-friendly solution for local planners, communities like Octopus to use this dashboard in the future, we have to develop methods which are able to be used by them. So we're trying to keep things at a basic level, but also maintain obviously the scientific rigor that we'd want to see in any of these projects. It's a very good question.
Dan. I'm just conscious of time, so I'd like to quickly follow up with some other questions. So Emily, she says, in the site design, when you had numerous sites within areas, you mentioned that some of the sites will be left to rest for, like, say, a year. Have you considered the access to communities and the willingness of them to switch sites when the soils need to rest and regain the nutrients?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and so this is this is one of the things that we want to follow up in this ethnographic study. I think, just casting my mind back to what I said, is that by expanding the number of spaces we can use, we can keep some of the more established and more conventional sites like allotments, we can give those a rest, or we can try new things out in those spaces. So it might not mean a complete fallowing of the site and left to go wild, but it might mean that they do change functions for a couple of years. But we hope that we can bring the community along with us. So I suppose there's two very short points to make. The first is that this project never sought to implement anything on the ground. So at this stage of the project, we're not thinking about interventions at any of these sites. That's the first point. The second point is that the community acceptance of using vacant and underutilized areas is something which is so important. It kind of needs to be weighed as much as the environment and spatial data into our decision making. So that ethnographic study, the reason why we took it out of this project, and we want to do a separate project on it, is because we've considered it to be so important and so instrumental in getting the weightings right on our dashboard. So hopefully in the future, with more STFC funding, we can integrate not just spatial and environmental data, but social data in there as well. And hopefully we can answer some of those questions around community acceptance and community.
I guess that leads into Solomon's question, actually, about the social data. So he asked, how many households are supported by the octopus community nursery, and do you know how they can participate and how they benefit from it, I suppose?
I don't know how many households are supported, but they have 8, like the tentacles of an octopus. They have between 8 and 10 different sites across the London Borough of Islington, and these are scattered in all the 4 corners of the borough. So they're widely distributed. They have probably the highest momentum, the greatest momentum of any food growing initiative in the borough. So they're certainly known to the community. And when I've been at the sites around the Octopus Community Plant Nursery, the local people around there have been involved. When we held that workshop in July at the nursery site, community residents were coming onto into the nursery, and you could see that there had been for many years a very strong relationship between the residents, the people who work in the community, and the Octopus initiative. So you can find more information out on their website. They have a very accessible website, and I'd certainly suggest and encourage people to have a look at that.
That'd be great if you can put that website in the chat, and also if you could put your details in, because there are a couple of very specific questions. So somebody's got a question about how they can improve soil for their grapes, and I would say if they can contact you directly for things like that, because what I'd like to do now is just open it up so that we can have a group discussion, and essentially just to raise your hand if you have a particular point. There was I'm sorry, Akbar, because we've lost some of the details in the transfer, but I know you had a point that you wanted to talk about. You mentioned that the challenges, there it is. So you mentioned the challenges about getting council and local neighbours on board. So if you want to speak now and talk about that more broadly, please do. And likewise, if anyone else has anything, just raise your hand. Everyone's gone all very quiet and shy. It was me worried that I was preventing people from talking. Okay then, so I've just got one other question really. So it starts right from the beginning, when we talked about how we met at Agritech East, and you said there was a lot of transfer from rural to urban. I guess what I'm thinking as well is taking it out of the UK, because rural isn't that far from urban. you know, we can, the distances are really not too bad if you compared to somewhere like Africa, or where, I say Africa, I hate when people do that. This is an entire continent. But there's so many parts of the world with such great big differences. Do you see that your model could possibly be scaled up so that you could start exploring how you can start connecting people that are that far away from each other?
Yeah, absolutely. We've already begun to create some networks across Europe. So we have the Porto is probably our next point, with the local government of Porto in Portugal are very keen to look at this. And I know that when we go to a different climate or a different land use context, a different culture, those environment, those spatial, those social characteristics will be very different. But this is, in a sense, yes, the dashboard certainly could well be used in the future to optimize different land use capabilities for the rural sector as well. So we could look at how we can make more efficient decisions using our rural land by using some of the optimization programs that Joe and STFC have helped us create in this project. So that's one way we could take it out of the city, but we are at the moment concentrating on upscaling this in other European cities. Yeah.
And Solomon, I can see you've got your hand up if you had something to say.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, and thank you, Dan, for the very good presentation. I unfortunately have to run in 2 minutes, but I hope that I can ask a question and maybe get your response. So I'm Solomon from Uganda, and I am a bit, I really like the where you're coming from in terms of utilizing open spaces in the cities. But I think, as somebody said, there are a lot of disparities between the cities, and the applicability of what you present clearly applies to all over the world. But of course, there are a lot of differences in the way the cities are designed. For example, in Europe and developed countries, you're looking at, people look at open spaces as more as having, for example, how do I call it? They want to have this recreational or open space which is not cultivated, and people can go and sit there and relax and get cool air and something like that. While on the other side of the globe, you're looking at open spaces, and if you can promote urban agriculture, then you're also contributing in a way to the food security situation, which are serious in some of these countries. So I think that there are multiple ways of looking at it, and how this kind of information can be used. Depends on part of the world and on the part of the city where you're doing. And as somebody said, for us here, we have cities and the urban areas, peri-urban areas, and urban and peri-urban agriculture would really be very much welcome. And then there are a lot of unutilized spaces. And the reason I asked the question on the octopus kind of community gardens, it's something that, for example, in our setting here can be done in terms of, to get sustained production in the city with small area, then it will need very good use of inputs, which is sometimes individual farmers in resource constrained setting cannot afford. So having this kind of a community garden in the cities, and then designing all these ways in which they can have resources jointly, would be something that is very much welcome. But I think that I will try to find an opportunity to have maybe a discussion with you on this. But I think that we have to look at the applicability and how we can collaborate with people who have different sorts of conditions and setting in the cities, urban settings, compared to what London is, for example. I know that this is a pilot project and you start with London, but you could think about how we can model the use in the other open areas, also in other.
Solomon, I really
Thank
think
you very much.
you should come and join our expert working group for the next round. You've got some really valid points there, and I think we don't have enough time to discuss them all, and they definitely need discussing. So I'm going to task you to make sure that you find out about our expert working group, and you can contact me. I'll just stick my email there in if you and I'll do some connections and make sure that you're involved. Okay. Right, so thank you everyone for coming. Thank you very much, Dan, for that excellent talk. You've put your details in, haven't you? And I would say to anyone again, if you've got a specific question, do get in touch with Dan. Do follow him on Twitter as well. Always doing really interesting, exciting things when he's not on the radio. So yes, you know, listen out to what he's doing elsewise, get back in touch with us for that working group, and have a lovely Christmas really, and a happy new year.